Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this October 21st, 2014 edition of Nightcast. Opening story tonight, Sweden has boosted its military presence in the Stockholm archipelago. Rising tensions between Russia and Scandinavian countries over the Ukraine crisis. Authorities say the mobilization of ships, troops, and helicopters is in order to scour the capital's waters for foreign underwater activity. Tim Allman has this opening report.
Look very carefully at this picture. Somewhere beyond the trees, a grainy image and a mystery. What could it be? A fishing boat? Sweden's very own Loch Ness monster? Or perhaps a Russian submarine? For the last few days, the Swedish Navy has been scouring the waters off Stockholm. The military receiving a, quote, credible tip-off that something fishy was taking place in the Baltic.
The Swedish Armed Forces notes it is likely that foreign underwater activity is ongoing in the Stockholm archipelago. That is the second highest verification on our assessment scale, and that, of course, means the operation continues.
This wouldn't be the first foreign underwater activity in Swedish waters. In 1981, a Russian sub carrying nuclear weapons became stranded, leading to a diplomatic standoff. This time the Swedes say something is up, but they're not yet pointing the finger directly at Moscow.
It could be a submarine. It could be a diver using some form of moped-like underwater vehicle. And it could be divers that don't have any business on our territory. I think that's the scope of what could be called foreign underwater activity.
Russia is denying all knowledge of any incident involving one of their submarines, but there are reports a rescue ship is heading to the area. In the meantime, this game of underwater hide-and-seek continues. Tim Allman, BBC News.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim Allman. And friends, the lead-in to that report points out that while media reports, well, let me back up a little bit. When authorities were saying mobilization of ships, troops, and helicopters is in order to scour the capital's waters, capital of Sweden's waters, for foreign underwater activity, that was being said while media reports were suggesting that Sweden is searching for a submarine, and then you heard Tim Allman's report on that. Friends, my next story, and it'll be the only two stories we're doing tonight. This next one will be the last story for tonight. I'm going to have to read it to you. It's a feature-style report written by Gavin Hewitt, the Europe editor for the BBC. And we do have a few photographs that go along with this story. This first one, the caption under this photograph reads, 5 years on, Greek anger at the bailout conditions of the EU and IMF continues to resonate in Athens. Exactly 5 years ago, Europe awoke to its own crisis. In October 2009, the incoming Greek government revealed that its budget deficit was not 6.7% as publicly stated, but closer to 13%. The published accounts were as good as fakes. In the weeks and months that followed, Europe had to confront the possibility that a Eurozone country might not be able to fund itself. So, the Eurozone crisis was born. It was precipitated by the financial crash of 2008, but that only served to expose the design faults of the single currency. I'm going to stop from the article for a moment, friends, and point out to you that the single currency, the Eurozone, its real bottom line design is to create a currency for Europe that is not dependent upon the world reserve currency, the present current world reserve currency, the United States dollar, the Yankee dollar. And the real bottom line is that this single currency would replace the Yankee dollar as the world reserve currency and itself become the worldwide reserve currency upon which the standard of value upon which other currencies relate value. Russia and China are already trading among themselves without reference to the Yankee dollar. They've already begun to break that tie. The design behind the euro was to break away from the American dollar and to create a threefold union for Europe. One, monetarily with the euro. Two, politically, a political union that would bring ultimately, even though the designers of Europe don't understand and know this, to bring it ultimately into a 5-and-5 pact, 5 from the east, 5 from the west, as God has prophesied, and will cause it to become established when we see 5 from the west and 5 from the east. And we don't necessarily mean countries. We mean could be regions. It could be countries whose borders are redefined. Who will do that redefining? You can bet your boots that one of the world's great religious power, the one that Satan is most behind, will play a big hand in it. And I'll just make this point for the moment. We're watching what's going to be happening when Pope Francis speaks on November 29 in Strasbourg before the European Parliament. He has accepted, as we've been telling you for the past couple of weeks, Pope Francis has accepted an invitation to speak before the European Parliament in Strasbourg on 29 November this year. But now, back to this story with Gavin Hewitt. For 5 years, the Eurozone crisis has overshadowed everything, or the Eurozone euro crisis has overshadowed everything else in the European Union. This week, Gavin Hewitt says, when European leaders meet this week for a summit, it will intrude again, the euro financial crisis. For over a year, the financial markets have acted as if the crisis was over. They brought into the much reported claim that recovery had taken root. They were right in one sense. The threat of the Eurozone breaking up had passed, and they were no longer worried about insolvency. The caption on this next photograph I'll bring forward, friends, reads, "Stock markets fell in Europe and across the world last week. As it emerged, German growth was slowing." Last week, however, a wider reality emerged, and the markets were rattled. It was not just about Europe. They were unnerved by Islamic State, by the Fed reducing the monetary flow, by the weakness in emerging markets, by fears of Chinese debt. But the game changer was Europe and the figures that showed that Germany, the motor of the Eurozone, was close to recession. Its growth was slowing, and its exports showed the largest monthly decline in 5 years. Investors began factoring in the risk that Europe was was inching towards deflation with a future of stagnation. Even so, apart from Greece, the bond spreads hardly widened and borrowing costs remain historically low, according to Gavin Hewitt in his report. For not everything is negative. The Eurozone is running a trade surplus. Exports are performing strongly. Deficits are coming down. Some countries which needed rescuing have not only left their bailout program, but are growing again. But there's another reality, the legacy of insecurity. Officials and economists have consistently underestimated the impact of the crisis on the lives of ordinary people. It largely goes unreported, and yet it explains why consumers in so many countries are reluctant to spend. A crisis cannot be over when 25% of young people are without work. A crisis cannot be over when the middle class in Greece, Italy, and France feel battered and fearful. 2 weeks ago in Milan, Mr. Hewitt, Gavin Hewitt, says that in his report here that I'm reading to you, friends, he says he heard from a middle-class manager who said there were no jobs for over 50-year-olds. You get a sense of the crisis when you realize how many Italians have raided their savings, or how many families in Spain are dependent on money from grandparents, or how many so-called new jobs are short-term contracts. All of this fuels what Bill Clinton calls resentment votes. It breathes wind into the sails of Greece's radical left leader Alexis Tsipras and the National Front, FN, in France. Europe once again is at a crossroads. The drama will play out over the next few weeks. France and Italy are not only opposed to continuing austerity, which they identify with Germany, but Paris has decided to openly flout the rules governing Eurozone budgets. France's 2015 budget shows it will not be back in line with the Stability and Growth Pact until 2017. The caption on this photograph with this story, friends, reads, France has called on Germany to invest 50 billion euros over the next 3 years. At the height of the Eurozone crisis, one of the key reforms demanded by Germany was that the European Commission would be given new powers to monitor national budgets and, if necessary, to levy fines against the rule breakers. Next week, the Commission will have to accept or reject the French budget. It is the first sensitive decision that the Juncker Commission will have to take. Politically, it is hugely sensitive. There are those in Brussels who are warning that to fine France would play into FN leader Marine Le Pen's hands. Others are saying that there cannot be one set of rules for big countries. There are many German politicians lining up to warn that once again the rules governing the single currency are being ignored. Publicly, Angela Merkel is insisting that the strengthened rules must be obeyed. But France is defiant. We won't cut any more, says its finance minister. There is speculation in Germany that Berlin is determined to avoid an open clash with Paris. There's talk of reviving the idea of France essentially signing a contract that commits it to taking certain steps, structural reforms, in exchange for greater flexibility over the budget. The most likely outcome is a murky compromise. That is the Brussels way, and Jean-Claude Juncker is unlikely to want an early clash with France. Part of a wider divide, Gavin Hewitt says. The French are suggesting to Berlin that it invest an extra 50 billion euros. That'd be the equivalent of 40 billion British pound sterlings or 64 billion Yankee dollars over the next 3 years to increase demand. The French are openly dismissive of Germany's moves to balance its budget at a time of declining growth. They call it German dogma. The Italians, too, are testing the rules of the fiscal pact with a budget which includes tax cuts for workers and firms. Rome is insisting that these steps are covered by the exceptional circumstances clause of the pact. And friends, the caption for this photograph is, like France, Italy's Prime Minister Matteo Renzi wants looser rules on budget deficits. What Paris and Rome want is a relaxation of the budget rules for Germany to make big investments in the infrastructure, for Europe to boost spending, and for the ECB, the European Central Bank, to turn on the monetary taps with quantitative easing. What you hear in Berlin is that France and Italy need to move beyond talking about freeing up the labor market and to implement much-needed reforms. If the Great Divide widens and Germany digs in its heels, then much is at risk. Simon Tilford from the Center for European Reform says, this is a recipe for stagnation, deflation, and political populism in France and Italy. It may culminate in a breakdown in relations between Germany and these countries and could even lead to a Eurozone breakup. Germany and France have demonstrated during this crisis that when the Eurozone is at risk, they compromise. But there's a fundamental issue here, whether France will be allowed to ignore the rules that were introduced to safeguard the single currency. And that's the bottom line of it right there, friends. That's the end of Gavin Hewitt's report, ending with, again, this statement. But there's a fundamental issue here. The fundamental issue is this: whether France will be allowed to ignore the rules, whether France will be allowed to ignore the rules that were introduced to safeguard the single currency. Friends, that's it for our short report on Nightcast tonight. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow evening, Wednesday evening, with the day's news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. As we go off the air tonight, I want to give a salute to the family and the friends of Miss Shirley Ann Armstrong. And I'll just leave it at that as to who she is. Those of you who know who she is, you'll know what I'm saying. And her funeral is tomorrow. So our condolences over the loss of Mom to Mark and David and Matt and to the rest of the family, and Scott Hammer, who I believe Shirley is Scott's sister. Scott was my roommate, not only my dorm mate, but my roommate, and four of us to a room. Scott was in the bunk, the bed, right next to mine. He was a most wonderful roommate, very considerate, very respectful, and best wishes to you, Scott, in the loss of your sister. With that, friends, I'll say so long for tonight, and until next time, this is your host for Nightcast, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.